Old Yeller, Chapter 6. Till little Arliss got mixed up in that bear fight, I guess I'd been looking on him about like most boys look on their little brothers. I liked him all right, but I didn't have a lot of use for him. What with his always playing in our drinking water and getting in the way of my chopping axe and howling his head off and chunking me with rocks when he got mad, it didn't seem to me like he was hardly worth the bother of putting up with. But that day when I saw him in the spring so helpless against the angry she-bear, I learned different. I knew then that I loved him just as much as I did Mama and Papa, maybe in some ways even a little bit more. So it was only natural for me to come to love the dog that saved him. After that, I couldn't do enough for old Yeller. What if he was a big, ugly, meat-stealing rascal? What if he did fall over and yell bloody murder every time I looked crossways at him? What if he had run off when he ought to have helped with the fighting bulls? None of that made a lick of difference now. He'd pitched in and saved little Arliss when I couldn't possibly have done it, and that was enough for me. I petted him and made him over till he was wiggling all over to show how happy he was. I felt mean about how I'd treated him and did everything I could to let him know. I searched his feet and pulled out a long mesquite thorn that had become embedded between his toes. I held him down and had Mama hand me a stick with a coal of fire on it so I could burn off 3 big bloated ticks that I found inside one of his ears. I washed him with lye soap and water, then rubbed salty bacon grease into his hair all over to rout the fleas. And that night after dark, when he sneaked into bed with me and little Arliss, I let him sleep there and never said a word about it to Mama. I took him and little Arliss squirrel hunting the next day. It was the first time I'd ever taken little Arliss on any kind of hunt. He was such a noisy pest that I always figured he'd scare off the game. As it turned out, he was just as noisy and pesky as I'd figured. He'd follow along, keeping quiet like I told him, till he saw maybe a pretty butterfly floating around in the air. Then he'd set up a yell you could have heard a mile off and go chasing after the butterfly. Of course, he couldn't catch it, but he would keep yelling at me to come help him. Then he'd get mad because I wouldn't and yell still louder. Or maybe he'd turn over a flat rock. Then he'd stand yelling at me to come back and look at all the yellow ants and centipedes and crickets and stinging scorpions that went scurrying away, hunting new hiding places. Once he got hung up in some briars and yelled till I came back to get him out. Another time he fell down and struck his elbow on a rock and didn't say a word about it for several minutes, until he saw blood seeping out of the cut on his arm. Then he stood and screamed like he was being burnt with a hot iron. With that much racket going on, I knew we'd scare all the game clear out of the country, which I guess we did. All but the squirrels. They took to the trees where they could hide from us. But I was lucky enough to see which tree one squirrel went up, so I put some of little Arliss's racket to use. I sent him in a circle around the tree, beating on the grass and bushes with a stick, while I stood waiting. Sure enough, the squirrel got to watching little Arliss and forgot me. He kept turning around the tree limb to keep it between him and little Arliss till he was on my side in plain sight. I shot him out of the tree the first shot. After that, old Yeller caught on to what game we were after. He went to work then, trailing and treeing the squirrels that little Arliss was scaring up off the ground. From then on, with Yeller to tree the squirrels and little Arliss to turn them on the tree limbs, we had pickings. Wasn't but a little bit till I'd shot 5, more than enough to make us a good squirrel fry for supper. A week later, old Yeller helped me catch a wild gobbler that I'd have lost without him. We'd gone up to the corn patch to pick a bait of black-eyed peas. I was packing my gun. Just as we got up to the slab rock fence that Papa had built around the corn patch, I looked over and spotted this gobbler doing our pea picking for us. The pea pods were still green yet, most of them no further along than snapping size. This made them hard for the gobbler to shell, but he was working away at it, pecking and scratching so hard that he was raising a big dust out in the field. "Why, that old rascal," Mama said. "He's just clawing those pea vines all to pieces." "Hush, Mama," I said. "Don't scare him." I lifted my gun and laid the barrel across the top of the rock fence. "I'll have him ready for the pot in just a minute." It wasn't a long shot, and I had him sighted in, dead to rights. I aimed to stick a bullet right where his wings hinged to his back. I was holding my breath and already squeezing off when little Arliss, who'd gotten behind, came running up. "What you shooting at, Travis?" he yelled at the top of his voice. "What you shooting at?" Well, that made me and the gobbler both jump. The gun fired, and I saw the gobbler go down. But a second later, he was up again, streaking through the tall corn, dragging a broken wing. For a second, I was so mad at little Arliss I could have wrung his neck like a frying chicken's. I said, "Arliss, why can't you keep your mouth shut? You've made me lose that gobbler." Well, little Arliss didn't have sense enough to know what I was mad about. Right away, he puckered up and went to crying and leaking tears all over the place. Some of them spattered clear down on his bare feet, making dark splotches in the dust that covered them. I always did say that when little Arliss cried, he could shed more tears faster than any crier I saw. "Wait a minute," Mama put in. "I don't think you've lost your gobbler yet. Look yonder." She pointed, and I looked, and there was old Yeller jumping the rock fence and racing toward the pea patch. He ran up to the place where I'd knocked the gobbler down. He circled the place one time, smelling the ground and wiggling his stub tail. Then he took off through the corn the same way the gobbler went, yelling like I was beating him with a stick. When he barked treat a couple minutes later, it was in the woods the other side of the corn patch. We went to him. We found him jumping at the gobbler that had run up a stoop in live oak and was perched there, panting, just waiting for me. So in spite of the fact that little Arliss had caused me to make a bad shot, we had us a real sumptuous supper that night. Roast turkey with cornbread dressing and watercress and wild onions that little Arliss and I found growing down in the creek next to the water. But when we tried to feed old Yeller some of the turkey, on account of his saving us from losing it, he wouldn't eat. He'd lick the meat and wiggle his stub tail to show how grateful he was, but he didn't swallow down more than a bite or two. That puzzled Mama and me because when we remembered back, we realized that he hadn't been eating anything we'd fed him for the last several days. Yet he was fat and with hair as slick and shiny as a dog eating 3 square meals a day. Mama shook her head. "If I didn't know better," she said, "I'd say that dog was sucking eggs. But I've got 3 hens setting and 1 with bitty chickens, and I'm getting more eggs from the rest of them than I've gotten since last fall, so he can't be robbing the nests." Well, we wondered some about what old Yeller was living on, but didn't worry about it. That is, not until the day Bud Searcy dropped by the cabin to see how we were making out. Bud Searcy was a red-faced man with a bulging middle who liked to visit around the settlement and sit and talk hard times and spit tobacco juice all over the place and wait for somebody to ask him to dinner. I never did have a lot of use for him, and my folks didn't either. Mama said he was shiftless. She said that was the reason the rest of the men had left him at home to sort of look after the women folks and kids while they were gone on the cow drive. She said the men knew that if they took Bud Searcy along, they'd never get to Kansas before the steers were dead with old age. It would take Searcy that long to get through visiting and eating with everybody between Salt Licks and Abilene. But he did have a little white-haired granddaughter that I sort of liked. She was 11 and different from most girls. She would hang around and watch what boys did, like showing how high they could climb in a tree, or how far they could throw a rock, or how fast they could swim, or how good they could shoot. But she never wanted to mix in or try to take over and boss things. She just went along and watched and didn't say much, and the only thing I had against her was her eyes. They were big, solemn brown eyes and right pretty to look at, only when she fixed them on me, it always seemed like they were looking clear through me and saw everything I was thinking. That always made me sort of jumpy, so that when I could, I never would look right straight at her. Her name was Lisbeth, and she came with her grandpa the day he visited us. They came riding up on an old, shad-bellied pony that didn't look like he'd had a fill of corn in a coon's age. She rode behind her grandpa's saddle, holding to his belt in the back, and her white hair was all curly and rippling in the sun. Trotting behind them was a blue-ticked she-dog that I always figured was one of Belle's pups. Old Yeller went out to bay at them as they rode up. I noticed right off that he didn't go about it like he really meant business. His yelling bay sounded a lot more like he was just barking because he figured that's what we expected him to do. And the first time I hollered at him, telling him to dry up all that racket, he hushed, which surprised me, as hard-headed as he generally was. By the time Mama had come to the front door and told Searcy and Lisbeth to get down and come right in, old Yeller had started a romp with the blue-tick bitch. Lisbeth slipped to the ground and stood staring at me with those big, solemn eyes while her grandpa dismounted. Searcy told Mama that he believed he wouldn't come in the house. He said that as hot as the day was, he figured he'd like it better sitting in the dog run. So Mama had me bring out our 4 cowhide bottom chairs. Searcy picked the one I always liked to sit in best. He got out a twist of tobacco and bit off a chew big enough to bulge his cheek and went to chewing and talking and spitting juice right where we'd all be bound to step in it and pack it around on the bottom of our feet. First he asked Mama if we were making out all right, and Mama said we were. Then he told her that he'd been left to look after all the families while the men were gone, a mighty heavy responsibility that was nearly working him to death, but that he was glad to do it. He said for Mama to remember that if the least little thing went wrong, she was to get in touch with him right away, and Mama said she would. Then he leaned his chair back against the cabin wall and went to telling what all was going around in the settlement. He told about how dry the weather was and how he looked for all the corn crops to fail and the settlement folks to be scraping the bottoms of their meal barrels long before next spring. He told how the cows were going dry and the gardens were failing. He told how Jed Simpson's boy, Rosal, was sitting at a turkey roost waiting for a shot when a fox came right up and tried to jump on him, and Rosal had to club it to death with his gun butt. This sure looked like a case of hydrophobia to Searcy, as anybody knew that no fox in his right mind was going to jump on a hunter. Which reminded him of an uncle that got mad dog bit down in the piney woods of East Texas. This was way back when Searcy was a little boy. As soon as the dog bit him, the man knew he was bound to die, so he went and got a big log chain and tied one end around the bottom of a tree and the other end to one of his legs, and right there he stayed till the sickness got him and he lost his mind. He slobbered at the mouth and moaned and screamed and ran at his wife and children, trying to catch them and bite them. Only, of course, the chain around his leg held him back, which was the reason he chained himself to the tree in the first place. And right there, chained to that tree, he finally died, and they buried him under the same tree. Bud Searcy sure hoped that we wouldn't have an outbreak of hydrophobia in Salt Licks and all die before the men got back from Kansas. Then he talked a while about a panther that had caught and killed one of Joe Anson's colts, and how the Anson boys had put their dogs on the trail. They ran the panther into the cave, and Jeff Anson followed in where the dogs had more sense than to go, and got pretty badly panther mauled for his trouble. But he did get the panther. Searcy talked till dinner time, said not a word all through dinner, and then went back to talking as quick as he'd swallowed down the last bite. He told how some strange varmint that wasn't a coyote, possum, skunk, or coon had recently started robbing the settlement blind. Or maybe even it was somebody. Nobody could tell for sure. All they knew was that they were losing meat out of their smokehouses, eggs out of their hens' nests, and sometimes even whole pans of cornbread that the women folks had set out to cool. Ike Fuller had been barbecuing some meat over an open pit and left it for a minute to go get a drink of water, and came back to find that 3 or 4 pound chunk of beef ribs had disappeared like it had gone up in smoke. Salt Licks folks were getting pretty riled about it, Searcy said, and guessed it would go hard with whatever or whoever was doing the raiding if they ever learned what it was. Listening to this, I got an uneasy feeling. The feeling got worse a minute later when Lisbeth motioned to me to follow her off down to the spring. We walked clear down there with Old Yeller and the blue-tick dog following with us before she finally looked up at me and said, "It's him." "What do you mean?" I said. "I mean it's your big yeller dog," she said. "I saw him." "Do what?" I asked. "Steal the bait of ribs," she said. "I saw him get a bunch of eggs, too, from one of our nests." I stopped then and looked straight at her, and she looked straight back at me, and I couldn't stand it and had to look down. "But I'm not going to tell," she said. I didn't believe her. "I bet you do," I said. "No, I won't," she said, shaking her head. "I wouldn't, even before I knew he was your dog." "Why?" "Because Miss Prissy is going to have pups." "Miss Prissy?" "That's the name of my dog. And she's going to have pups, and your dog will be their papa, and I wouldn't want their papa to get shot." I stared at her again, and again I had to look down. I wanted to thank her, but I didn't know the right words. So I fished around in my pocket and brought out an Indian arrowhead that I'd found the day before and gave that to her. She took it and stared at it for a little bit with her eyes shining, then shoved it deep into a long pocket she had sewn to her dress. "I won't never tell," she said, then whirled and tore out for the house, running as fast as she could. I went down and sat by the spring a while. It seemed like I liked Bud Searcy a lot better than I ever had before, even if he did talk too much and spit tobacco juice all over the place. But I was still bothered. If Lisbeth had caught old Yeller stealing that stuff at the settlement, then somebody else might too. And if they did, they were sure liable to shoot him. A family might put up with one of its own dogs stealing from them if he was a good dog. But for a dog that left home to steal from everybody else, well, I didn't see much chance for him if he ever got caught. After Bud Searcy had eaten a hearty supper and talked a while longer, he finally rode off home with Lisbeth riding behind him. I went then and gathered the eggs and held 3 back. I called old Yeller off from the house and broke the eggs on a flat rock right under his nose and tried to get him to eat them. But he wouldn't. He acted like he'd never heard tell that eggs were fit to eat. All he'd do was stand there and wiggle his tail and try to lick me in the face. It made me mad. "You thieving rascal," I said. "I ought to get a club and break your back in 14 different places." But I didn't really mean it, and I didn't say it loud and ugly. I knew that if I did, he'd fall over and start yelling like he was dying, and there I'd be, in a fight with little Arliss again. "When they shoot you, I'm going to laugh," I told him. But I knew I wouldn't.